A garden after midnight, old olive trees, a man face down in the dirt, sweating hours from arrest and a day from a Roman cross. He is praying the hardest prayer a human being has ever prayed, and the first word out of his mouth is one that millions of people today would tell you means daddy. Sit with how strange that is for a second. A man on the edge of the cross reaching for a word we have been told is the smallest, simplest thing a child could say. It is not. And that gap between what the word has been turned into and what it actually carried is one of the most quietly beautiful things hiding in the whole New Testament. You have probably heard the cozy version from a pulpit. Someone lowers their voice and says that when Jesus prayed in the garden, the word he used was Abba, and that Abba is just the Aramaic way a tiny child says daddy. It sounds beautiful. It feels close. It has been preached in 1,000 churches and printed in 100 books by people who only ever wanted to help you feel how near God is. There is just one problem. It is not quite true, and not in the cold way where someone wants to drain the warmth out of your prayers and hand you a rule book instead. The warmth is real. The closeness is genuine. The word truly does carry a tenderness that should make you stop and breathe. The daddy picture got that part right. What it left out is the other half of the word, the part that makes the tenderness even more astonishing. And the scholars who study this language for a living have been gently filling that half back in for the better part of a century. So here is what we are going to do together. We will not strip the affection out of the word. We will find out what it actually held, which turns out to be far richer than the cozy version ever managed to be. The real wonder was never about how small the word is. It is about who you are allowed to say it to. Start with the word underneath the word. In Aramaic, the everyday language Jesus spoke in the streets and synagogues of Galilee, the basic term for father is Av. Short, plain, a building block of the language. Hebrew shares the same root, and you can hear it buried inside names you already know. Abraham, Abimelech, Abinadab. That little ab at the front is the father. Aramaic then does something to that word. It has a grammatical form, scholars call the emphatic state, and you do not need any grammar training to feel what it does. Think of the difference between saying father and saying the father. Think of the difference between a king and the king. The emphatic state takes the plain word and gives it a kind of definiteness, a settledness, a this one right here quality. When Av moves into that form, it becomes Abba. So Abba is not some separate special word standing apart from father. It is the word for father dressed in its most direct and personal form. The form you would actually reach for when you turned and spoke to the man himself face to face. That already starts to bend the popular story. But the real evidence is in who used it. The word Abba shows up in ancient Jewish writings, in prayers, in the rabbinic discussions unfolding around the time of Jesus, and in the generations after him. When you look at who is actually saying it, the cozy picture comes apart almost immediately. Grown sons use this word for their fathers. Grown daughters used it. It appears as a term of respect for honored teachers, the way a devoted student might address a master he revered. It even became a personal name that grown men carried through their whole adult lives. In the traditions of the period, you can find men of real standing and learning remembered by it. That last point is the one that opens the word up. Picture daddy the way we use it. A word that belongs to the early years and tends to stay there. Now set beside it the fact that Abba was also how a devoted student addressed a teacher he revered, an elder, a man whose every word he treasured. The word stretched across a whole life. It was the first word a child reached for, and it was still the right word when that child had grown, and it could even be lifted onto the shoulders of a wise old master as a title of honor. That tells you the tenderness in it never canceled the respect. It was the word a grown man used walking into his father's house at the end of a working day. Warm? Certainly the family word, the intimate word, the one no stranger would presume to use, and weighty at the same time. It carried closeness and honor together in a single breath, and no one who spoke the language felt the slightest tension between the two. Hold on to that because the whole study turns on it. Closeness and honor together with no contradiction. Keep it in your hand as we walk. To feel why Jesus using this word was so startling, you have to understand how Israel had spoken to God for most of its history. God as Father is in the Old Testament. It is there, but it is rarer than most people assume, and it works differently than we are used to. When the Hebrew scriptures call God a father, they almost always mean the father of the nation. He is Israel's father, the one who brought a whole people out of slavery and carried them like a son through the wilderness. You can hear it in the Song of Moses asking the people whether this is how they repay the Father who made them. You can hear it when the prophets cry out that God is their Father, even when every earthly comfort has failed. But notice what is happening in those passages. It is corporate. It is a whole people calling God Father together as a nation with a shared history. What you almost never find is a single person turning to God and saying simply and personally, "My Father." That individual address was rare to the point of being remarkable. Now, we have to be careful and honest here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that gets overstated. Some teachers will tell you no Jew ever called God Father until Jesus. That goes too far, and the evidence does not support it. Jewish prayer did hold the Father address. There are ancient prayers that begin Our Father, our King. There is the old liturgy about the prayers of Israel being received by their Father in heaven. The tradition of God as the compassionate Father of his people runs deeper than the overstatement allows. So the honest version is not a claim that the word was unheard of. The striking thing is how Jesus used it. He turned to God and called him Father directly, personally, constantly, as the natural and primary way he related to him. Open the Gospels and listen to him pray. And almost every time that is the word on his lips, Father, my Father. He did it so often and so intimately that it clearly was not a borrowed formula. It was the center of how he knew God. And then he did something almost more startling than that. He handed the word to his followers. He taught ordinary people to begin their prayers the way he began his. When you pray, he said, say, Our Father. He took the most personal name he had for God and placed it in the mouths of fishermen and tax collectors. And you stay on that handoff for a moment because it is easy to rush past how strange it is. This was a culture that guarded the holiness of God with enormous care. The most sacred name of God was treated as too holy to pronounce, so carefully that to this day it is written without being spoken. And into that careful, reverent world, Jesus does not just claim the Father relationship for himself as a unique son. He turns to a crowd of ordinary, unremarkable people and tells them that they may speak to the Most High the same way. Not the Father of Israel off in the distance addressed by the nation as a whole. Their Father, yours, spoken directly. The God whose name could barely be said out loud is now the God you are invited to address by the family word. That is the kind of access that should have made the disciples' heads spin. Most of us have heard Our Father so many times that the shock has worn smooth. But the first people to pray it were stepping onto ground that had been roped off for centuries. Into a world that, careful with the divine name, Jesus turns and says, Abba. You can begin to feel why it landed the way it did. Now watch where this word actually appears in the New Testament, because the first place it shows up tells you almost everything. Back to that garden. The Passover meal is finished. Judas is moving somewhere in the dark with the temple guard. The disciples are a stone's throw off, heavy-eyed, sliding toward the sleep that will embarrass them later. And Jesus is on the ground hours from arrest. This is the moment Mark chose to preserve the actual Aramaic word that left Jesus' lips. Not a paraphrase, the real sound he made in his own language, kept untranslated so that we would hear it. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible to you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. Sit inside that for a second. If Abba were only the small, simple word we have reduced it to, this is the strangest place in all of Scripture to find it. Because what is happening in this garden is the most grown-up moment in the history of the world. A son, fully aware of what is rushing toward him, staring directly at the cost, naming his dread out loud, and then choosing his father's will over his own terror. The word holds both of those at once. There is the raw, unguarded closeness of a child who can ask his father for anything in the world, who can say, remove this cup without softening it or dressing it up. And there is the surrendered trust of a grown man who can finish that very sentence with yet not what I want, but what you want. That is the deepest form of intimacy that exists. The kind that can be completely honest about its fear and completely yielded in its trust, both at once with neither one canceling the other. A small child reaches for the word and means love. A grown son reaches for it and means love that has counted the cost and stayed. The word was roomy enough to hold both. And in the garden, it is the grown son's whole heart. So when the word comes up as simply daddy, it is worth gently asking whether that one English word can carry the whole of Gethsemane. It carries the warmth. What it strains to carry is the weight, the reverence, the surrender of a son who loves and honors his father enough to trust him in the dark. Here is where the writers themselves settle the question, and the beauty of it is that you do not have to trust a single scholar to see it. You only have to notice what is sitting right there on the page. Abba appears exactly 3 times in the New Testament. Once in Gethsemane in Mark's account, twice more in Paul's letters, once in Romans, and once in Galatians. Every single time, all 3, the Aramaic word is immediately followed by the same Greek phrase, ho pater, the Father. Stop and think about what that pattern means. The writers preserved a foreign word their Greek-speaking readers could not understand on their own. Then, right beside it, they translated it for them. They told you outright what it means. And the word they chose was the ordinary, dignified, weighty Greek word that simply means Father. If they had heard the word as something smaller, Greek gave them ways to say that. They reached instead for the full honorable word, let that land. The people closest to the source, the ones writing while the language was still alive and breathing on their own tongues, looked straight at Abba and rendered it Father, a full word, a dignified word. They heard the warmth, kept the intimacy by preserving the original word, and translated it with all its weight intact. The text translates itself. When it does, it quietly disagrees with the bumper sticker. There is something else hiding in that little Greek phrase, ho pater, with its definite article out front. It is not a casual word. It carries respect built right into its grammar. So the early believers were not being stiff or distant when they used it, and they were not being flippant either. They were doing exactly what the Aramaic did, holding nearness and honor together, refusing to drop either side. Quick word before we go further. If these word studies are the kind of thing that makes you want to open your Bible and look closer, that is the whole reason this channel exists. Subscribing helps more people stumble onto these studies. And if you are already a member or a supporter of the work, thank you. You are genuinely the reason it keeps going. Now, back to the garden and to a question that has probably been forming in the back of your mind for the last few minutes. If the word never actually meant daddy, where on earth did the daddy idea come from in the first place? Somebody started it. And the story of how it started is more gracious than you might expect. It came from a good place. That part matters because this is not a tale about someone being careless or foolish. A respected scholar working in Europe in the middle of the last century noticed something completely real. He saw that Jesus addressed God as Father with a directness and a frequency that genuinely stood out against the prayer practices of his time. People in that world did not usually turn to the Almighty and speak so plainly and personally. Jesus did constantly. This scholar wanted to capture just how startling that intimacy would have felt to the people who first heard it. Somewhere in reaching for an image vivid enough to convey that closeness, the comparison to a small child's first word entered the conversation. The picture of a little one looking up and saying the simplest, most trusting word it knows. It was warm. It was memorable. And it spread like a grass fire in a dry season. The cozy informality of it landed in sermons and study guides and devotional books all over the world because honestly it felt so good to hear. The God of thunder and holiness, the one who fills the temple with smoke, and you get to call him by the tender little name a child uses. Who would not want that to be true? Who would not repeat a line that lovely? But other scholars kept studying the way careful people always go back and test a beautiful claim to be sure it holds. They combed through the ancient sources, the prayers, the rabbinic texts, the way the word was genuinely used by real people in real life. And what they found was that the word was even fuller than the short version suggested. The warmth was all there. So was the honor. The daddy picture had captured the tenderness and set the dignity to one side, and the dignity turned out to matter just as much. And here's the most gracious part of the whole story. The part that should keep any of us from ever feeling smug about getting it right. The scholar who started it walked it back himself before he died. In his later writing, he added a careful word of caution to everyone who had run with his idea. He said in essence that picturing Jesus as speaking the way a tiny child speaks went further than the evidence allowed, and he was honest enough to say he had once leaned that way himself. Think about that for a moment. The man who lit the match was also the man who tried hardest to put it out. The popular version had simply run faster than the correction could ever catch it. That is what happens with a really good line. It outruns the truth, and the truth spends years jogging along behind trying to flag it down. So none of this is about catching anyone out, and certainly not about looking down on the many faithful teachers who passed Daddy along. They were handing people something true. that God is near, that he is approachable, that you can come close. The instinct was right. The word simply holds even more than they had room to say. This is about letting it be as large as it actually is, instead of as small as a single English word can sound. It is worth asking why the shorter version took hold so warmly. Because the answer is tender. It took hold because it was reaching for something true. People are hungry for nearness to God. Many had spent years picturing him as severe and distant, hard to please, arms folded. So when someone said he is close enough to call daddy, it landed like cool water. That hunger was right. And the good news is that the fuller word does not pull the nearness back. It deepens it. People reached for daddy because they wanted to come close. The whole word tells them they are closer than they dared to hope, and that the closeness will hold, and it is large. That is precisely what gets thrown away when we shrink the word down to daddy. Go to Paul. Go to the two places he reaches for Abba, and you will see exactly why the grown-up reading matters so much. The mature word does not cool the comfort down. It gives it something solid to stand on. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul is describing a change of legal status. He talks about people who were once like slaves or like underage children with no rights to the family estate, no claim on the inheritance, no standing of their own. Then something decisive happens. God sent forth his Son, he writes, to redeem those who were under the law so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Read that slowly, because it is doing something enormous. This is not a sentimental scene. This is a courtroom and a family at the very same time. Adoption in the Greek and Roman world Paul was writing into was a serious and binding legal act, never a soft gesture. It took a person who had no claim and made them a full heir with a complete and permanent share in everything the father owned. The same legal standing as a child born into the family, old debts wiped clean, the new name impossible to undo. You were brought in from the outside and handed an inheritance that no one could take back, and a slave did not get to use the family word. A hired worker did not. A stranger did not. So when Abba comes climbing up out of your own mouth, you are not working yourself into a feeling. You are stating a fact about who you have become. And the proof Paul points to, the evidence that this staggering adoption is real and not wishful thinking, is the cry itself. The very same word Jesus prayed in the garden is now rising up out of your own chest. The Spirit of the Son places the Son's own word on your lips. You cry Abba because that is what he cries. The simple fact that you were able to cry it at all is itself the receipt, the proof that you genuinely belong inside the family. Now that cry shows up again in Paul's letter to the Romans, and there he opens it up even wider. In that letter, Paul sets two spirits against each other. There is the spirit of slavery which drags you back into fear, always anxious, always bracing for punishment, never sure of your footing in the house. And there is the spirit God actually gave you, the spirit of adoption, the one who teaches your heart to cry Abba. To call God by the family name is to stop flinching like a slave and start resting like a child. Then Paul says something that should steady you on your hardest day. That same spirit, he writes, bears witness alongside your own spirit that you really are a child of God. There are mornings when you will not feel like one, when the evidence of your own heart seems to argue the other way. Into exactly those mornings, Paul says, God himself testifies underneath your doubt that the adoption stands. The cry in your chest never depended on your performance. It is God bearing witness to his own work. And if a child, Paul goes on, then an heir of God, and a fellow heir with Christ. The word Abba opens straight onto an inheritance. The same standing the Son has by nature, you are given by adoption. He does not even let the suffering of this life undo it. The present hardship, he says, is not worth comparing to the glory that is coming. The end of fear, the witness of the Spirit, the inheritance, the glory, all of it folded into the word that some people thought meant nothing more than daddy. That is so much weightier than daddy could ever be. Daddy makes the whole thing cute and a little fragile, like a warm feeling that might fade by Tuesday. Adoption makes it solid. It makes it yours on purpose, permanently, at a price someone else was willing to pay. And that price is the part we cannot leave unspoken because it is the reason any of us can say the word at all. Go back to the garden one more time, but look at it from a different angle. Now, when Jesus prayed Abba in Gethsemane, he was speaking out of a relationship that was his by nature. He had always been the Son. There was never a moment when he stood outside the family looking in. The word was simply true of him, the way it is true that water is wet. We are in a completely different position by nature. The New Testament says plainly, we were outsiders, strangers to the family with no claim on the inheritance and no right to the name. So how does an outsider come to cry the same word the eternal Son cries? Only one way. Someone on the inside has to bring you in. And bringing you in cost him the very thing the garden was about. The cup he asked to have removed was not removed. He drank it so that the family word could become yours. You cry Abba because he cried it first. And because he went to the cross to make room for you in the only family that word belongs to. So every time the word forms in your chest, it carries the memory of that garden. The closeness you feel was purchased in the place where the Son sweat and surrendered his will. That is why the word can never be cheap, no matter how tenderly you mean it. The intimacy is real precisely because it was bought at a real and terrible price. Now there is a ditch on the other side of this road and we need to name it clearly before we go any further. Falling into it cost you just as much as the cozy mistake we started with. Some people hear Abba does not mean daddy and they swing all the way to the opposite extreme. They decide the intimacy itself must have been the error. They conclude that God is formal and distant after all, that they had better keep their voice low and their requests modest and their hearts at a careful, respectful distance. They take the correction and build a wall out of it. That reading misses the mark just as badly as shrinking the word did. And in some ways, it does more damage because it pushes you away from the very nearness the word was built to give you. The careful reading does not take the closeness away. It takes the smallness away. There is a world of difference between those two things. You are still invited urgently and sincerely to speak to God with a directness that should astonish you when you stop to consider who He is. You can bring Him your fear. You can bring Him your honest remove this cup. You can bring Him your half-finished stammering 3 in the morning sentences that do not even know how they want to end. The garden settled that forever. What you are not invited to do is treat Him as though He were less than God. As though holiness and warmth could not live together inside one small word. But they can. They do. They always have. A grown child standing before a father he genuinely loves and reveres does not stop loving the man in order to honor him or stop honoring him in order to love him. He does both in the same breath without straying. That is the entire point of the word. Lose either side and it collapses. Make it only warm and you get a buddy in the sky. Make it only formal, and you get a distant magistrate. Hold both and you get the actual living God near enough to call by the family name and holy enough to mean it. Picture a working estate somewhere in the ancient Near East. A wide courtyard, storerooms along the walls, the smell of dust and olives in the air. A landowner getting on in years, sitting in the shade in the cool part of the afternoon. And a son, a fully grown son, not a boy, entrusted over the years with real responsibility. The keys to the storehouses hang at his belt. He has authority to make deals in his father's name. He carries the standing of a true heir. The one who will one day inherit all of it, the land, the flocks, the household. That son crosses the courtyard at the end of a long day of managing the place. He sees his father resting in the shade, and he calls out the same word he called out when he was 5 years old and came running across that same courtyard on small, unsteady legs. Abba. Nothing about the word has shrunk in all those years. He is not a child anymore. He runs the estate, and the servants answer to him. But the name has not changed, because the relationship underneath it has not changed. It has only deepened and grown roots. The closeness of the boy and the dignity of the heir both riding on one small, ordinary word with no tension between them anywhere. That is the word Jesus prayed in the garden. That is the word the Spirit teaches you to pray. Not a small word for a small moment. The deep, clear-eyed trust of a grown child who understands everything, including exactly what it will cost, and who still says, "Father, I am yours." So, what do you actually do with this sitting wherever you happen to be right now watching this? Maybe you have kept God at arm's length your entire life. You believe He is real, you believe He is holy. But the idea of actually being close to Him feels presumptuous, almost rude, like sitting down in a chair that clearly belongs to someone far more important than you. If that is you, hear what the Word says back. If you are in Christ, the chair is yours. You were adopted into the family on purpose, at a tremendous price, and the arrangement is permanent. You do not have to earn your slow way up to the front of the room while everyone watches. You are already a son, already a daughter, already an heir. The inheritance already signed over in your name. The cry in your chest is the receipt. Or maybe your situation is the exact opposite. Maybe somewhere along the way, God quietly became too familiar. A buddy, a vending machine you visit when you need something, someone you talk at far more than you ever stop to listen to. If that is you, let the full weight of the word find you again. The same God you get to call Abba is the God whose will Jesus surrendered to with his face pressed into the cold ground of a garden. Nearness was never meant to cancel reverence. It was meant to make reverence warm and warmth deep instead of cheap. And maybe you are in the garden yourself tonight facing your own cup. The thing you would give almost anything to have pass from you. The diagnosis. The empty chair at the table. The door that closed and will not open. The fear that wakes you before dawn and sits on your chest. If that is where you are, then listen closely to how the prayer in the garden actually goes. It does not pretend the fear is not there. It says the hard thing out loud. All of it. Every bit of the remove this cup. Then, only then, it leans its whole weight back into the one who can be trusted with the answer. Whatever the answer turns out to be, you are allowed to pray exactly like that. You are permitted to be that honest, and that surrendered in the very same breath. That has never been weakness. It is the sound a grown child makes when he trusts a good father in the dark. The cozy version was always too small for the truth it was trying to hold. It made the wonder about the word, when the wonder was never about the word at all. The wonder is the access. Think of who we are talking about. The one who flung the stars across the dark and called the seas by name. The one before whom the burning ones cover their faces and cry that he is holy. That God has done whatever it took, paid whatever it cost, so that you specifically and personally you can turn toward him in the middle of your worst night and use the family name. Not because anyone shrank him down to a size you could be comfortable with. The exact reverse, because he reached down and lifted you up into his family. That is the gift hiding inside this one small word that so many people already loved. It was never only a tender word for the very young. It was always an invitation into the household of God. Warmth and honor in the same breath. The word does not make God smaller, it makes you closer. And it tells you the closeness was bought to last. Abba, Father, both at once forever. If even one word of this helped you see your Father a little more clearly today, leave it down in the comments, because even one word helps us reach someone who needed to hear it and did not know where to look. Subscribe so the next study finds its way to you, and share this with the person who came to mind while you were watching, because chances are they came to mind for a reason. And may you come to know more deeply than you ever have the nearness of the Father who calls you his own. God bless you.